You are now relearning economics.
Welcome back to the live stream. So I've decided each week I'm going to react to like the worst economic takes we can have. I think that'd be a lot of fun in a lot of ways. I've struggled to find out what I'm going to do with my channel. Originally, it was like a system dynamic modeling tutorial. And I did that for about a year and then I just kind of fell off. And then I've tried different, videos where I'd have to sit and edit them or pay somebody else to edit them. And that was a whole lot of work. And I realized, well, live streams are quite easy. You don't edit them. They're live. Like, so that's great. I don't gotta edit them. I'm just like pressing like in my streaming software the play button, literally. And I'm going live. And of course the downfall is it could be a royal screw up per se. So it is what it is. I was gonna do one of these last week, government spending. So it was a narrative from a Canadian broadcaster about the American debt. This week, a fellow named Dr. Richard Warner did an interview with Tucker Carlson about banking and how banks can create money. A lot of my followers and subscribers know who Richard Warner is. There's not a lot to say about him. Some people consider him Keynesian. I just consider him like an institutional economist per se. He studies how institutions work, and he's done a lot of work with commercial banks in that realm. So that's kind of my extent of knowing him. I'm, half interested. I think he's had bad takes on like monetary policy and government debt, but that's another story. And in this video, it's not going to be about me necessarily critiquing his background. Now, what I saw on Twitter or X is Bob Murphy, Dr. Bob Murphy, and Dr. Jonathan Newman. Now, Jonathan Newman is kind of like the Jonathan Franks from Star Trek, Commander Riker of Austrian economics, and Bob Murphy is kind of like the Captain Picard of of Austrian economics. So it's quite the integration. Of course, this is if Captain Picard had a beard. Um, so they decided, well, they're going to kind of take on, Richard's perspective. And I was interested. They even announced it. I was like, okay, well, this is going to be an interesting take. A lot of people think, well, I'm really harsh on Austrian economics, but really, I enjoy interacting with Austrian economics as opposed to, let's say, neoclassical economics. So they have a very, very rich written history from their authors, and I would suggest anybody would try to give some of the material a read. So this isn't necessarily going to be a critique against Bob or Jonathan. In fact, I like them both as human beings. However, I imagine they're going to have takes that I don't agree with, because Austrian economics often has takes that I don't agree with. Now, I tried this last week with a video; it didn't work, but I looked at my streaming software, did some investigation. You know how when you like as a guy you're putting something together and maybe you're doing it for your wife or your girlfriend or some significant other and you won't read the instructions, right? You're like, no, I'm a guy, I can do this. Well, that's how I tried this last week, and I realized I needed to read the instructions. So your audio is choppy. This is good. Okay, and let's bring up the chat. Let's say hello to the chatters first. Bring them up. Is it still choppy, Dave? Because I can go into some system settings. It's so hard to do this live, right? I've got software for the mic, software for the camera, software for the stream. Um, Anybody else experiencing some choppy audio? Remember, this is a live stream, so it does happen. I think you. Okay, here we go. I think your mic is directional. Can't face camera while you talk. It's yeah. So in my software settings, so if I put this a little closer, so I'm back here and I'm talking into it, I do have a like a limiter, right? So if I turn away, it'll drop out. Let me change something here. Let's try this before we get into the kind of reaction part of the video. Fix this up. This is something I should test. Again, I should be doing a little more reading on audio setup for my mic. Now, I do have another preset that will eliminate the limiter. And we can go, let's try classic radio. Let me know how that sounds, the classic radio. Because I don't want my audio to be shit going through the video. Oh, we've got Dave. Dave's in the house. Bob is an effing Klingon. Well, it actually kind of does look like from the classic series before they had their ridges. Definitely a classic Klingon. Dave, does that mean it sounds better? I don't know. Overreacting, noise canceling. That's working. Okay. We got 2 Daves in the house. So we've got how to build a world brain. That's Dave. And then we've got Dave Crossland. That's Dave too. The Django Geek. This is better. Okay. We're gonna leave it at that. So I'm gonna play this video. I'm gonna jump in and react. See, like I said, some things I'm probably gonna agree with Bob on. Some things I'm not. So we'll give it a whirl here. I'm gonna shut down the chat and we'll give it a play. Here we go.
Talking about our favorite topic, money creation. The guest Tucker Carlson recently had was Richard Werner, and I truthfully can say, folks, I have never had so many people requesting that, hey, Bob, you gotta take on this interview. Like I want, or not just like, oh, take this guy down, but also people just genuinely saying, I'm really curious to hear, Murphy, what your response is to this. And I was telling people, well, we're going to be doing a response, and people were anxiously awaiting for it. So, Jonathan, that's where we are now. So
I just got to jump in. Like, look at these beards. If I was ever going to join the Austrian economic family, I'd have to grow one of those beards. They're incredible.
So just to give context, folks, so Tucker Carlson had Richard Werner on, who is a German-born economist who did a lot of work in Japan. And, if you go watch the Tucker interview, he can give more of his background, and they take 3 hours and go through and really, tells the guy's career and everything. There's a lot there. So why don't we have plenty of clips, folks, and we're going to focus on what's pertinent, I think, to Austrian economics specifically. But before we dive into some of those details, Jonathan, I'm curious, do you want to give your just general reaction to the interview?
Yeah, my general reaction was that, it was fun. It was entertaining. Werner was saying lots of, interesting things, some of them provocative, some things where I was just sort of like, face palming, because like some of the things that he was saying is like, are like these amazing insights that only he has, and that he's discovered these things are things that Austrian economists have been saying.
So I clipped through the Richard Werner interview with Tucker Carlson, and because the topic matter, I've heard it so many times before, endogenous money. I kind of just went through it and was like, yeah, okay, he's giving a lecture from an endogenous money type perspective. So I didn't like watch it from end to end, nor have I watched this video. I did watch the beginning of it, but if you're interested, I think it did end up on YouTube, but definitely go on Twitter X and you can watch the full interview with Tucker Carlson
For over 100 years. But another like general reaction that I had is that he's sort of an ink blot. A lot of people, depending on the school of thought or the sort of ideology that you're coming from, you're able to see some certain things that he was saying and identify with it. But other things that he would say would like totally contradict or go against what you would think. And so he doesn't fit squarely into a school of thought, as far as I'm concerned, at least based on the limited exposure that I've had just from his Tucker Carlson interview. I've read some little pieces of his papers and his book, The Princes of the Yen. But like when he's talking about how evil central banking is and how fractional reserve banking originated based on fraud, I was thinking all the Rothbardians are cheering. But then he would turn around and he would talk about how fractional reserve banks ought to limit their loaning, their lending activity to businesses so that they can engage in profitable production and employ people. And I was thinking, oh, somebody like George Selgin, a fractional reserve free banker, is going to be totally on board with that. But then also there's some things in there that MMTers would latch on.
So that's a big thing. So right now, between like Bob Murphy and George Selgin, they kind of battle it out between 100% fractional reserve banking and just or 100% reserve banking and versus fractional reserve banking. It's quite entertaining to watch those two go at it. It's kind of like watching Steve Keen and Warren Mosler go over the international trade debate. Very entertaining for me. So it's quite interesting, and that's where I was saying at the beginning of the show, I don't quite fall in lockstep with Richard Warner on monetary policy. Like, I think he's very intelligent. He's done a lot of work with commercial banks, but I think even though he's worked with the Bank of Japan, he kind of falls short in the monetary monetary policy section of economics.
Peers would latch onto, or post Keynesians. Many of the empirical, like modern mainstream economists, like the fact that he's doing these tests, actually going to the inside of a bank and seeing how things operate. So really, one other thing I just saw some like standard Keynesian stuff in his, at least in the beginning parts of his book, The Princes of the Yen, where he's talking about the problem with Japan is that it had insufficient aggregate demand. But then also it sort of sounds like monetary disequilibrium theory, because he says there wasn't enough money and the central bank and the banking system always had this opportunity to increase the money supply. So I know I'm like throwing a bunch of stuff out there, but my point is that everybody was able to see something that they liked and something that they disliked about this interview. And I think that helps explain why it made such a splash, because there was so much meat on the table for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That you're right. That some people were sharing it out of love and some were sharing it out of annoyance or incredulity. My quick, just overall reaction to it is, yeah, there is a lot in here. Well, let me put it to you this way, Jonathan. I was concerned that my initial gut reaction, because right out of the chute, Tucker introduces him as, at first I thought he said the most famous economist in the world, and then I re-listened to it. And he said something like one of the world's most famous economists, something like that. I hope this doesn't rub you the wrong way, Jonathan. I checked. You have more Twitter followers than this guy does. And so, no, he cannot be one of the world's most famous economists if that's a true statement. So I'm curious, have you heard of, like when you heard like, oh, Rich?
So Bob's actually kind of posting one of his third accounts that has like 6,000 followers or something like that. And Jonathan has 10,000 followers, and it doesn't really matter how many followers you have. You've had people like Steve Keen on Lex Friedman. He's only got 100,000 followers, right? And Lex Friedman, top 5 podcast out there. So that doesn't mean a whole lot. And his actual main account has 40,000. So this claim about Jonathan being more famous because he's got more Twitter followers is fallacious at best. But I'm sure Bob was just kidding there.
Like when you heard like, oh, Richard Werner is on Tucker, were you like, oh, I want to go see what he's, or did you say who? Did you, like, because my honest reaction, I didn't know his name. It didn't ring a bell when I first heard it.
No, I didn't know his name. That doesn't mean a lot. I'm not trying to like put him down or anything, but yeah, I hadn't heard of him before. I think I've heard people refer to Princes of the Yen before.
Yeah. So right, that's exactly. It's kind of like someone says some name of a famous singer and you're like, what? Who's that? And then it's like, oh, he, and then like they hum some song that was like big in the 80s. And you're like, oh, that guy? Okay, I just didn't know his name. Similar thing here. That when I first heard that and Tucker's introducing him as the most famous economist or one of the most, I was like, what the heck? And then the more he talked, the Prince of Yen I'd heard, and then the thing too about he's got a paper or like this documentary thing that they did where he went into a bank and worked with them to see what actually literally happens mechanically when the bank gives me a loan. And that was like a big split. And so I've heard plenty of people who don't like the Austrians and say, you guys, rely on this textbook fractional reserve model, and that's been discredited. And so I was like, oh, that's the guy, because they always point to, so and so empirically demonstrated, you fools. So anyway, I realized, as it went along that, oh, this is why he's such a big deal, because this is, his thing. And so I remembered a lot of people had pointed to him over the years, but again, it's just to say he's the most famous economist in the world. I literally his name didn't ring a bell. And, people could say that proves how ignorant I am, but, I think I'm fairly well versed in economics. So anyway.
When you lead off in a debate and it's about popularity and not the substance, I'm starting to already question this video. I'm hoping we get into the meat of things pretty quick here. Maybe I will fast forward some of this, but we'll carry on and see if we can kind of get into the substance of this conversation.
Wait, the point of that, besides my dumb joke about your Twitter following, Jonathan, by the way, I wasn't kidding. You really do have more Twitter followers than he does. So,
well, I saw I think he has 2 accounts. So I don't know if you were.
I checked all the ones I could find, and one of them was a blue check mark. It wasn't like some Stan account. It looked like it was really his account. As far as I could tell, it was blue check mark, and it wasn't. This is a fan account of blah blah blah. So, anyway, what I was going with this though is to say, because there's so much in there, and the title's very provocative. Like the connection between the central banking and the CIA and war. So it's all stuff that's red meat, especially since I've been loving Tucker lately for having people like Daryl Cooper on. And so I realized, Jonathan, my initial emotional reaction, and then as you say, when he's going through and claiming originality on stuff that Mises wrote his dissertation on in 1912, I was like, give me a break. But I realized, oh, hang on, I can't just be like the conventional historians who bristled at Tucker introducing Daryl Cooper as America's most honest historian. And when, if Daryl Cooper's main narrative is stuff that the public has never heard before, and it's very important what his claims are, and yeah, if you quibble about some nuance he gives to something that happened in 1943, like that's not enough to just throw out the episodes. This guy's a charlatan. So I'm trying not to do that here too. That yes, there's a lot of stuff he says. It was clear Tucker's mind was getting blown by stuff that to you and me, Jonathan's like, well, how do you not know that? This is, didn't Tucker go read Mises' Theory of Money and Credit in the original German? And apparently not. So anyway, that's the point being that, yes, I'm glad that this interview happened. I'm glad Tucker's mind was blown. But one of the main things that happened in this discussion, folks, is that Werner is claiming originality, or at least in modern times, saying that, oh, yes, this notion that banks just create money ex nihilo when they make loans, this is something that, they don't want you to know. And we're going to spend a lot of time going through it. And in particular, he dismisses what he called the fractional reserve theory of banks, which everybody would associate with the Austrian school. And so that's what Jonathan and I are.
So there's a big thing going on right now. As Austrians, at least the smart ones like Bob and Jonathan are slowly realizing that just the terminology of fractional reserve banking is kind of pointless, because there's no causal inference for it anymore. There's a big push to kind of keep it in with different, reasons. Well, banks settle between each other, so there's still fractional reserve banking, which you should just call settlement banking. It's quite interesting that I'm seeing more and more of this recently. So it'll be interesting how Austrian economics adjusts. And, Warren Mosler, I'm not a particular fan of Warren. I like his original insights and stuff like that. Often says, Austrian economics isn't compatible with a floating fiat currency, and that it's only applicable to a fixed currency, maybe fixed to something like gold. But I will give Austrian economics some credit. I think you can transfer a lot of their theories into a floating exchange rate fiat currency.
That's what Jonathan and I are going to spend most of our time on here. So a lot of it's going to be us nitpicking and coming off as being very critical. But overall, by all means, go watch the interview. And again, I'm glad it happened. I'm glad Tucker had him on. But a lot of what is going to follow from this, I'm guessing, also hearing your initial reaction, Jonathan, we're going to be fairly critical. Is there anything you want to add before we dive into the clips?
No, I'll just echo, God bless Tucker Carlson. He's been on a roll recently, having Scott Horton on, Daryl Cooper, all these great guys. He had Ron Paul on a while ago. I would love to see somebody who's like, explicitly representing the Mises Institute there, like somebody like you or Tom Woods or Guido Holzman, Joe Salerno, Tom DiLorenzo. That would be fantastic. Dream come
Jonathan
true.
Newman, if he wants to get a fresh face, someone who's got a higher Twitter follower than one of the most famous economists in the world.
I really hope he corrects himself on that. Jonathan's great guy, great beard. I like some of his takes. Definitely does not have as many followers as Richard Warner.
For what that's worth. Okay, so let's dive in. So we're going to play this first clip now for you folks. It'll be fairly self-explanatory. I don't think we need to set this one up, and then Jonathan and I will unpack it.
So the solution to all this.
So I'm going to skip the Richard doing his interview with Carlson, because I think you can go watch that on its own merits. And we'll just we want to get the responses out of Bob and Jonathan, and they've been going off 15 minutes here about Twitter followers, and not the substance. So hopefully, after this clip, we'll get to a little bit of that. And I'll just try to fast forward it here a bit, see what's going on. Maybe I should have clipped, here we go.
So if this is the point where you're going to bring up Mises, let's not explain what Mises' overall theory of the business cycle is.
Play out.
So
In the hands of the government is what people feel, but it's not true. That's not how it works. And so what is the answer? Well, of these three theories of banking, which one is correct? Well, what's the scientific thing to do? Is to do an empirical test. That's what a scientist would do. But it turns out I was the first to do an empirical test of the three theories of banking.
Okay, so I'm curious to get your reaction. Let me just remind you, Jonathan, I know you've looked at the clips. Later, we're going to get into his view of why, the right way to corral these credit-creating banks into doing socially useful things. So if this is the point where you're going to bring up Mises, let's not explain what Mises' overall theory of the business cycle is, but just if you want to comment on him explaining that, yes, I was the first person to actually really nail down the fact that banks create money. Can you believe it?
Yeah, so just to recap, I'll play a role that you usually play, just to make sure everybody got that.
Make sure we're not losing anybody, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So he's outlined three different views or theories of how fractional reserve banks work, or how money is created through the banking system, if it is at all. And so the first theory he calls the financial intermediation theory. And so this theory, as he sets it up, is that banks are taking in deposits. I guess it doesn't have to be demand deposits. It could be time deposits, savings deposits, and they take in that money from their customers, their depositors, and then other people come into the bank and they're asking for a loan, and the bank evaluates these different people or business projects or mortgages that they could make, and so but ultimately what they're using to finance those loans are other people's deposits. So the bank is an intermediary. They're between the savers and the borrowers.
Right, yeah.
The
public is saving, giving their funds to the banks, and the banks are just evaluating the credit worthiness, because the banks, that's their job to figure out, this guy might default, let's not give him the money, we'll charge a higher interest rate. But yeah, they're just passing through the savings that are coming from somewhere else. The banks aren't generating that themselves.
Right. So if that's as far as you take it, then there's no money supply growth. It's literally just a transfer of money from one person through the intermediary to the borrower. Now, the second theory that he talks about he calls it the fractional reserve theory, and this is where he brings up the money multiplier. So once you start with that financial intermediation theory, and then you think about what do the borrowers do with the money after they receive it as a loan. And so they'll spend it, they'll use it to build a house. And so the contractor, the builder of the house receives the money. And then you think, okay, well, they're going to deposit it in some other bank. And then if they deposit it in some other bank, then now that bank has funds that it can use to, it'll keep a fraction of those deposits in reserve, and then they'll make their own loans. And so that's the step-by-step process. He refers to the money multiplier, where you get these overlapping claims on the same base money, the same money that was originally deposited in the banking system. And through the multiplication of claims on the same money, then you get this increase in the money supply, broadly conceived, including the bank deposits. So that's another theory that he's rejecting. And the one that he claims that he has verified through this empirical test is the credit creation theory, which is that no, it's not deposit first and then a loan. It's actually the bank decides they just issue demand deposits as a loan to a borrower. So there's no drawdown of reserves. They're not taking money from one account and putting it into another account. They have a borrower come in saying, "Hey, I'd like to borrow to buy a house," for example, and then the bank just credits their checking account with new money. So it didn't come from anywhere else, and so that's why he calls it the credit creation theory. Now, interestingly, like I know you've discussed this in your Understanding Money Mechanics. I don't really.
I got to give credit. Jonathan's really articulated what Richard Warner said. So I got to give credit where credit's due. And this is what I said at the beginning of the live stream. Both Bob and Jonathan are really good critical thinkers, and I have a lot of respect for that. So far, they're articulating what Richard said. We'll see, what they agree with and what they don't agree with.
I don't really think it matters if you change the order from deposit to loan as opposed to loan to deposit, because I think you still get the money multiplier aspect there. You still get people taking the money, and then as they spend it, other people receive the money they deposit into other banks. Now, what's interesting is that once you think about those consequences of people spending the money that they've borrowed from the bank, even under the credit creation theory, then you see that the original bank has to have expected, or at least they will see, a drawdown of their reserves as people spend it, and then the other banks are saying, "Hey, we've got these claims on your assets," and so the banks have to settle with one another. So yes, if you put on the blinders like what horses wear when they're drawing carriages down streets, if you just look at this original loan contract, it certainly looks like credit creation. But then you have to think about what happens later. Like the money does not just sit in that person's account that was credited with the money in the first place.
So this is the big point of contention, right? And it kind of goes right at the Austrian theory, is that, fractional reserve banking causes the business cycle. And I'm saying, adjustments in the interest rate. But you got to really look that it's not the act of settlement balances, or as the US calls them, reserves, that drives credit creation. It's credit creation drives the need for settlement balances, right? So you got to look at what the causal perspective here is, right? So when I'm modeling like national economies, right, that's a big feedback loop, is credit creation by commercial banks. Economic activity will drive the velocity of reserves going between banks, right? But you really, at the end of the day, banks will net. What happens is they net all their transactions between other banks, and what's left over, they'll use the Fed wire to settle overnight. In fact, the Fed wire is live now, so they can do it during the day. But it's very important to nuance that credit creation drives the settlement balances. Settlement balances or reserves do not drive credit creation.
They're going to spend it. Other banks are going to receive it. There's interbank settlement. So there's going to be a drawdown of reserves. So once you see that drawdown of reserves, then it starts to look like, hey, there's financial intermediation going on, because while the order is reversed, this loan did necessitate a drawdown of reserves. So there was a transfer. And then when you talk about other banks receiving the money, and so they have an increase in the amount of reserves, suppose that's above their desired reserve ratio. As soon as you take that into account, then you can get the money multiplier. So like my response to all of this is that these three theories aren't mutually exclusive. They're really just describing different aspects of the same story. Some of them are more narrowly looking at one particular aspect, and I think the one that explains it most fully is the one that he's calling the fractional reserve theory, because that talks about all of the knock-on, all of the later effects that or consequences that happen after the loan is made.
Yeah, I love all that. I know at some point we got to work in. We were going to flash a screenshot because you tweeted out in response to this.
Yeah.
So is this a good place to do it?
Yeah, we can do that. So he actually sort of acknowledges this in his paper. He says, see if I can.
Just to be clear, because you didn't just watch the Tucker interview, you actually went and read his paper or one of his papers? Okay.
Yeah. Give me 1 second.
Mississippi. Forgot you're in academia, so for you, time dilates.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so he's talking about how he says the evidence is not as easily interpreted as may have been desired, since in practice it is not possible to stop all other bank transactions that may be initiated by bank customers, in parentheses, who are nowadays able to implement transactions via internet banking even on holidays. So he's saying that we didn't get all of, like, the evidence wasn't as good as we had hoped because there were all of these other transactions going on at the same time while we were observing this bank when the loan happened.
This is his empirical test. This is the write-up of his empirical.
So, Dave, I'll put a screenshot up of the actual Richard Warner account, and he has 40,000 Twitter subscribers. That's the one right there. I'll make this big. And this, I think, is one of his original accounts. So it's at Scientific Econ. And he's got 3 accounts. And this one was created in 2017. And he's not really a big Twitter X guy anyways. But anyways, is anybody that was interested there, I saw it in the chat. And we'll carry on with Bob and Jonathan talking.
That everyone's pointing to, like, oh my gosh, for the first time in history, an economist actually tried to test something and see how the world works. Wow. And so he went to a bank and said, I'm going to take a loan from you, and I want us to just document everything going on. And he's saying in that paper, ideally, the bank would have done nothing else except process my loan, and then we could see exactly what the before and after were. But in practice, no, the bank, even though they were working with me and being very nice, they weren't going to stop everything else they were doing. So money's coming and going. All these other transactions are happening overlaid on top of mine. And so it wasn't as clean of a test as one would have hoped for.
Yes, and my point, the quick point that I made on Twitter is that those follow-up transactions are actually critical for understanding how money is created, whether or not.
So we got a question, and a valid question here. If deposits don't drive to credit creation, then if banks stop taking deposits, and I guess you're referring to reserves, would they be able to continue creating credit? Of course, they did it in the 19th century all the time. Banks would often hold accounts with each other and settle that way, right? So absolutely, they can continue to create credit. There is nothing now with the reserve ratios dropping down to 0 in 2020. There is nothing left that drives settlement balances driving credit creation. So it's just the way it is, and there's many techniques to create credit. Banks are innovative because all they do is accounting, right? And I'm not saying if it's right or wrong, right? So this isn't about is Austrian economics, wrong in a normative sense. So they ought to have some sort of, gold-backed fiat or gold-backed currency. This isn't about that. I've always been interested in the structure of the current economy and how things actually work, and what are the causal effects, right? What are the causal inferences?
Or not, you can reject the fractional reserve theory or the financial intermediation theory. Like if you're just looking at the creation of a brand new loan, of course that's going to look like credit creation. But the other theories are talking about, well, what are the other effects of this loan creation? Does the money end up in other banks and then they use it to pyramid and create new loans, and then you get the overlapping claims. And once you take all of that into account, then you can start to see the aspects that are described by the financial intermediation theory and the fractional reserve theory.
Right. Great stuff. So let me try. So folks, we'll probably be snappier in response to the subsequent clips here, but this is the meat and potatoes of what we're trying to accomplish in this episode. So I don't want to breeze through this too quickly. I agree exactly with what you said, Jonathan. Here's how I'll describe it. So we're not losing, folks. Definitely the Mises Rothbard people of the 3 buckets that Werner just described would be the fractional reserve camp, and that Werner and his disciples or fans would say, you Austrians are living in the past. Don't you understand that old textbook way of explaining stuff is obsolete at this point? All right. So here's how I would explain it like how I would comment on the three categories he listed. The first one, to say banks act purely as intermediaries where the public saves funds, hands them over to the bank, and the bank just lends it out. And you could say, in principle, you wouldn't need banks, right? That if somebody wanted to just, some couple wants to borrow $300,000 to go buy a house, they don't have it, they want to borrow it from somebody, and then 10 separate couples who have $30,000 they want to save each over a 30-year stretch, all chipped in and gave it to that one couple to borrow, that could all work. And you could have 30 separate contracts explaining we're lending you $30,000 at this percent and you're going to make payments over the next 30 years. And you could go ahead and do that, but of course that would be hard in terms of just the transaction cost for them all to find each other, and it would be extremely risky, right? If you're the saver, one of those that, geez, my money.
I find it fascinating that this is still a topic of conversation. Let's just end that here, and they may talk about it more. Banks are not loaning your deposits. Okay, they are not taking in your deposits and then loaning them out to another individual. So I don't know why this conversation is going on. Now, banks will sell you financial assets. They will take that credit, right, because it becomes their equity, and they will inject it into other investment opportunities. So in that sense, if you agree to buy one of these financial assets from the bank, there is a form of intermediating funds there, like credit funds. We're not talking about reserves. So that in that aspect, it does exist. But the idea that you go and deposit your paycheck, and then they take a portion of that paycheck and lend it out, that's just fallacious stuff at this point. So I'm not sure why the Austrians continue to even debate this conversation. It's just a known fact that doesn't exist. It shouldn't even be a theory anymore. It's Ptolemy astronomy, essentially, right? Like, why would you even talk about it anymore? It's kind of silly. But anyways, we'll carry on.
Is if this one couple defaults, then there goes my savings, right? And so instead of doing that, of course, what happens in practice is, there's these thing called banks, and all the savers deposit their funds with the bank, or lend their money to the bank, I should say more accurately in this model. And then the bank pools it and lends it out, and everyone kind of just participates in the diversification and pooling. And if some couple defaults on their mortgage, that loss gets spread among everybody, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So if you had what Rothbard in his writings refers to as loan banking, that would be fine. And banks would be pure financial intermediaries, where it would just, the only function they would serve is what I just said in terms of like assessing risk better and facilitating the diversification and pooling of the risks and so on. But the banks wouldn't be creating credit beyond what the original savers did. And the households would be restricting their consumption. That's how they come up with $30,000 or whatever I said, because they're consuming less. That frees up resources. And so the economy shifts away from making consumption goods and shifts into other things like building houses and long-term, projects. Okay. And by the way, in that model, if you wanted to have a checking account, in Rothbard's view, if the banks are operating correctly and non-fraudulently, then if you go put $10,000 in your checking account, the bank can't lend any of that out to anybody. If somebody wants to buy a house and say we need a mortgage, they can't tap into that $10,000. No, that's a checking account. That guy still thinks he has that money. So that's, if banks obeyed those rules and like it was only CDs or long-term savings accounts and things that they could lend out, then there's no money creation. The banks are pure intermediaries. Okay. All the Austrians would say that is not true empirically. That's not how banks operate, whether you think it's a good or a bad thing. And so that's why they would fall into the second category, the fractional reserve model, which, as the name suggests, means, yes, there's reserves in there that are backing up the checking accounts, but the banks don't keep them all in there. So somebody deposits $1,000, the teller puts the $1,000, into the vault at the night, at the end of the day, and that money doesn't all sit in the bank vault. They end up lending some of that out. So that's the fractional reserve idea. And then just elaborate where Werner was talking about when he says, yes, there is money creation in this model.
Sorry, Bob, I gotta stop you right there, Bob. So there are banks out there in all nations that will carry zero reserves during the day. So they have no fraction, right? They will find them at the end of the day if they need to settle anything, or they might just end up netting or have accounts with other banks and not even need, like in the US's situation, the Fed wire. So just to put that out there, This is another reason why I say that even the term fractional reserve banking is just, it's obsolete now, and it leads to a false impression. But we'll carry on.
Model, but it's like the aggregate outcome of the system. So here's what he means. And I'm just, again, elaborating on what you said there, Jonathan. The way you would teach this in a standard thing, the way textbooks used to treat it, the way I probably taught it in undergrad was, oh yeah, somebody deposits $1,000. Let's just say, to have concrete numbers to work with, the banks keep 10% in reserve. We're just making that number up. There were some regulations in place, but just to keep the math simple. Right, so of the $1,000 that's in there, that guy still thinks he has $1,000 in his checking account. He doesn't think he's loaning money to the bank. He's like, no, the bank is just storing my money for safekeeping and convenience, as far as this guy is concerned. The bank only keeps 100 of that in the vault, takes 900, lends it out to some other guy who wants to borrow $900 for something. Then this story is that guy goes and spends it. Ultimately, you know, the store where he spends it, what does that merchant do with it? They don't just keep it on the premises. They go deposit it in their bank. So from that other bank's point of view, it's like the store just walked up, the employee from the store, with $900 in cash and said, hey, we're depositing this into our business checking account. And so the process repeats, right? Because that store doesn't care about the history of where that 900 come from. They just say, oh, here's 900 new cash in your checking. Well, we're only going to keep 10% of it, right? So they only keep 90 of that there. And then, what is it, 810 gets lent out to some other guy. And then, so with each stage, 90% of that original amount gets lent out again in the form of cash, the way this story was conventionally taught in the textbooks and on blackboards, you know, in the 50s through the 80s, let's say. Okay, and so notice, when all is said and done, where does that process end? I mean, it's technically an infinite sequence, but, you know, in the limit, that original $1,000 now is spread among all the bank vaults in the country or the world economy, serving as the 10% base. And so you say, well, how much in total new checkable deposits could be supported by the $1,000 in currency that is the base? Well, if it's a 10% reserve, then you just times 10, right? So that means ultimately there's $10,000 worth of checking account balances, backed up by the the $1,000 in currency sitting in the vaults spread around the world. Okay, and so the sense, so if you started with $1,000 in physical cash, currency, green pieces of paper, and when the dust settles with all those loans and loans and loans and loans and redeposits, blah, 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 10,000 now, people are walking around thinking they have that in the bank. Well, that's creation of $9,000 that the banks have, in a sense, created and pyramided on top of that. And the money multiplier is 10 in that example, right? It's like 1 over the reserve ratio, 1 divided by 0.1. Okay, so there, again, I just want to point out, it's a little bit misleading when he's saying, my theory of the banks creating money versus, because even right there, even his own explanation, and when I spelled it out for you exactly what he has in mind, the banks created $9,000. The Fed didn't create that $9,000. It was clearly the commercial banks did. Okay, then the last one is Werner is saying that the tweak he's making, the way he's saying, no, what we're saying is not the story that door number two was, is he's saying it's not that the first person gives the $1,000 in currency into his checking account.
So I had to break this video up into 3 parts just because it was so long. My streaming software couldn't handle it. So we'll carry on, but make sure you find me on Twitter X. You can at Relearning Econ. You can find me at patreon.com/relearning economics. Or you can find me at relearningeconomics.com. You can find out all the different work I do there, right? So it's not just my Patreon and Twitter. I actually, employ myself at firms to make money. It'd be nice if I made money on live streams, but I just don't think I'm going to get up to the Lex Friedman caliber of putting myself on YouTube. So right now, what Bob is doing is going through the different theories. I got to give these guys credit. They're being quite thorough here. So I'm hoping in the next part, we've got some pushback from both Jonathan and Bob on what they disagree with Richard on. Here it is.
Goes into the vault, and then the bankers take out 900 in cash and give it to the next borrower. And then that guy has to go spend it. And eventually that has to he's saying, no, the moment what happens is when the bank grants the loan to that second borrower or the second guy who is a borrower, the act of granting the loan in terms of the accounting and the legality and the mechanics of the banking system, at that moment of decision, $900 has been created ex nihilo in the economy. Whether or not that guy even takes physical possession of the 900 in currency, right? The original 1,000 is still sitting in the vault. It was the bank's decision to grant credit that created $900. And so my point is right. And I admit some of the people teaching the standard fraction reserve theory, whatever, they probably didn't realize that, but that is implicit, and that's something that when I started teaching this, like I realized it, and it's like, yeah, that's really, when you're just trying to isolate where is the rabbit getting into the hat for this magic trick, like how do banks create money? That's what it is, right? Because even if the guy takes the money out, and the other guy, he's walking around town now with the 900 in currency, the money supply has already been increased by 900, right? He doesn't have to go spend it and deposit it. It's the fact that the first guy put the 1,000 in, he still thinks he has 1,000.
Nobody's taking out their loans in actual currency anymore, Bob. So let's kind of drop that again. I always stick to like the structure of the modern economy, right? That's not a reality. You don't go for a loan from the bank for a house and you take out $900,000 and go pay the contractor to build your house.
He has $1,000, so M1 is still 1,000 from there. People know those monetary goods, and then the bank gives the 900 to the second guy. He now thinks he has 900 in cash balances. He has an IOU. He has a debt to the bank. Don't get me wrong, but a debt doesn't subtract from the money supply. It's just a separate thing on the side. So that guy thinks he has 900 in cash. Whether he keeps it in the bank on deposit, and when you say you have 900, what do you mean? Whether he takes his ATM card and puts it in and says, see, 900, or if he flashes 9 Benjamin Franklins, either way, it's in M1. So I'm just saying, even if you just stopped and you were a total card-carrying fractional reserve banking theorist, I could show you just, thinking through introspection and think that clearly it's the bank's decision to grant the credit that created the 900 there, regardless of whether the guy, took the money out physically or left it with the bank. And then the last thing I'll say here, Jonathan, is I liked how you put it in your tweet that, so if it seems like, well, what's the difference? Aren't we saying the same thing? Well, no, I still think the fractional reserve story is more accurate and better to teach people, because the banks, if all you knew were, oh, banks can just create money, you know what I mean? Like you think it's the central bank or the government. No, banks just create money by the mere act of granting loan. Then it's wonder, like, how come the banks aren't all trillionaires, the bankers? And the reason is, like you're saying, because they have to be careful. They can't just grant, loans to themselves and then go buy yachts and things, because there's the reserves that.
It's not the reserves that are the risk now. So if you look at international banking, we have large corresponding banks. No reserves are being there's no transaction of reserves in that situation. So you have like Bank of the America, which is a large corresponding international bank, and it'll have accounts with small domestic U.S. banks. It might even have accounts with small European banks, or they might have an account with a large European corresponding bank, and they will create credit, loan to each other, and keep the system flowing, right? And just settle that way. The ultimate thing with the bank, Bob is correct. Reserves make up a portion of their assets, right? But we've moved to like capital reserve requirements, not or capital requirements. So capital ratio requirements, not fractional reserve requirements where you got to keep 5% or 10% in settlement balances anymore. So there's other assets that the bank's holding, right? So if you keep calling this fractional reserve banking, you might as well call it fractional reserve mortgages, fractional reserve bonds, fractional reserve any asset the bank has, right? It's the question is, what causal influence does it have, right? And what are the real risks to the bank? And the bank never, now, unlike any other corporation, it cannot go into negative equity, right? So that is the biggest constraint for a bank, not what amount of settlement balances it has. Literally, like I said, and you can look at the data, commercial banks often go days without reserves. That is the reality of it, right? So to suggest that reserves are the constraint on credit expansion is fallacious at best, right? There was a time where there was a required reserve for that, and that was a regulation, right? But banks still had many other assets, right? And so that's why they've moved to capital ratios and stress tests to make sure banks are safe and make sure they always stay in positive equity.
the way the interbank clearing system works is if one bank expands too rapidly and grants too much credit and its customers are going around spending money, then the other banks get piling up claims on that first expansionary bank and it loses its reserves just in the interbank clearing process. So when you understand how all that works and why there's limits on what the banks can do, and Werner in the Tucker interview alludes to that. He said stuff like, no, they got to.
Banks are in it for the profit motive. When they give out a loan, right, they're trying to extract some of that credit, right? And so they can then use that credit. So essentially, banks will have cash equity, which is bank credit, right? And that's what they use to pay the workers. They don't pay their workers in reserves. Okay, they don't pay their workers and those assets. The only asset on the asset side of their ledger, right, is their cash equity, which is a form of bank credit, right? And that's what they pay. Banks' main motive is profit, right? So they're not going to go down the road of, I'm going to give out this loan to somebody I know they're not going to pay me back. That's a waste of their time, right? There's a simple cost benefit analysis there, right? That's why banks don't make loans to risky customers, right? Because there's no profit in it, right? They're going to take the time to make loans to credit-worthy people. And again, this isn't what ought to be or what ought not to be, right? A normative statement. That's just the way banks operate.
To be careful and blah, blah, blah. But when you spell out, well, why do they have to be careful? It's because, the fractional reserve people, you got to go read their writings to understand. And like somebody like a George Selgin or Larry White in their free banking model, they go ahead and model it. They think it's cool. Rothbard would say it's not cool, but we all agree just because banks legally can engage in fractional reserves doesn't mean they can just make loans to each other and go buy yachts and say, hey, we could just create money, ha, ha, ha. You know what I mean? So anyway, I know that took a while, folks, and I promise we'll be snappier going forward in this episode, but I really wanted to just nail down, I think this is critical, that when people are like, you fractional reserve theorists have been disproven, it's because if you're just ignoring what happens after the bank grants the loan, then you can forget about reserve. But no, reserves are important whether or not they're legally required. Okay, I know I went on a long tangent there, Jonathan. Anything you want to say?
Settlement balances are important for settling between banks. That's not fractional reserve banking. That's not keeping a portion of their deposits at the Federal Reserve to loan out. That's just not a thing. I don't know why they keep going down this train of thought. Because reserves are important, that means fractional reserve banking is thing. No, it's not. It's settlement banking, and that's just part of the system.
Before we move on,
I'll do it very quickly. Mm-hmm. I don't want people to think that we're just sitting in our armchair, like we've been presented with this empirical evidence from Werner, and it's like, well, no.
Jonathan's literally sitting in an armchair right now.
No, if you think about it, it must be like this. I know it sort of looks like that because we're sitting in chairs and we're just thinking through. But
I'm in a kneeling chair, if that matters. But
I just want to point out that if you look at Werner's paper, he says the evidence is not as easily interpreted as may have been desired, and the point that he's making there is there are all of these other.
Well, so Pet Rock says, correct to say Federal Reserve banks are now obsolete. Even when reserves were a thing, it was still a facade. No. Well, from the perspective of it being a settlement between banks, it's a thing. It's a part of the structure of the economy. It's something I would model in a system dynamic model, right? So to Bob and Jonathan's credit, they're saying, well, no, the balances that the Fed have are important. That's correct. But with their causal inferences are kind of ass backwards right now. And you are right. Even when there were reserve requirements, banks didn't care about it. This is why the Fed dropped them, right? One, because there was a crisis with COVID-19, but they weren't really that effective. Banks would simply go and find the reserves at the end of the night if they needed them to settle between banks, if they couldn't net their transactions with a big bank, right? So in that respect, you are correct. Once reserves got lower and lower down to 5%, 4%, 3%, the idea of a reserve ratio became obsolete in itself because banks didn't need to adhere to that during normal banking operations during the day, only at the end of the night.
Transactions that were conflating, they were muddling. And what we're saying is that, yes, those other transactions are an important part of the story. So like you have to think through or be an empiricist, look at what happens after this initial act of credit creation. And then once you do that, you see that what he's calling the fractional reserve theory actually does a better job of explaining the story in a full way.
Oh, I thought of another way to put it. Carlos Lara, actually, a guy I've co-authored some books with and done some projects with in the past. But when I first encountered him, he was actually he was using Rothbard's, I don't know if it was Man Economy. He was using something from Rothbard. He must have been Man Economy because Carlos was using my study guide. And that's how he reached out to me because we both lived in Nashville at the time. So anyway, he was doing a PowerPoint presentation around circa 2008, right when stuff was blowing up, explaining to conventional bankers around Nashville. He was giving these PowerPoint presentations explaining how fractional reserve banking worked. And it was blowing their minds. They would come up to him afterwards and say, we had no idea we were doing that. And so, and the way Carlos put it was great. It ended up being this book that we wrote called How Privatized Banking Really Works. But he said, so back at that time, this was when the Fed still imposed.
Do you ever get the feeling that Austrian economics, and granted, these guys really know their history, but do you ever get the idea that they're really good at reading other schools' theories, attacking them and saying they're wrong, and it ought to be another way, but not really being able to explain the present situation in an empirical way, right? Other than deferring to the Austrian business cycle, which in another video I'll get into. I actually would like to model that dynamically with a system dynamic model. I just don't agree that the Fed is driving the business cycle. That's a relationship between wages and profits oscillating between each other. And you pull off many Fred graphs and show that. I just get that feeling a lot. And that's where, as much as I love, the heterodox thinking and thinking outside of the box like Austrian economics does, which is far better than neoclassical economics, I just feel like they kind of get boxed in defending their theory via attacking other people's theories and reverting back to this ought to be this way because Mises said it should be, right? Or the Austrian business cycle, we flushed it out so well, even though we haven't formalized it in any real manner. Don't you kind of get that? That's where my frustration with the Austrian economics is, and that's where I turn shit off. But anyways, we'll carry on.
Those reserve ratio requirements on the banks, and so we just rounded it to 10%. It was more subtle and nuanced, but he was just saying, for the sake of argument, say it's a 10% reserve ratio. And so he was saying, I'm just going to adapt the numbers we've been using here, Jonathan. Strictly speaking, yeah, Jim Smith walks into his bank and gives 10 Benjamin Franklins over to the teller, says, I'm depositing $1,000 in cash into my checking account, and walks out. The 10% reserve requirement, if that's what we assume, is legally imposed, the bank would have the legal ability to go make a loan of $9,000 to somebody else, so long as they thought that person would just leave it sitting in his checking account and never spend a penny of it, right? Because then,
again, during the day, it wouldn't matter what the reserve balance is. They will loan to whoever they think they're going to make a profit from, and they will find any settlement balances if they need it because they can't net those balances with another bank. Then they'll go find it, right? So there was no loans officer ever sitting in a bank saying, oh, geez, there's that 10% required. I better go check the balance at my local Fed bank and make sure I've got enough balances. No, they're immediately going to establish the credit worthiness of that customer and make the loan.
That guy's 9,000 in checking plus Jim Smith's 1,000 would be 10,000 in checking accounts. And they'd say, what's in the vault right now? Oh, $1,000 in currency, 10% satisfied. But Carlos went on to say, but that would be ludicrous for them to give that much at that stage, because if that other guy spends any of that 9,000 that they just granted to him, well, then in the interbank clearing process, they're going to get hit on the 1,000. They're going to have to transfer that to another bank, in terms of the money will go out of their vault over to the other bank's vault or on deposit with the Fed. They'll debit their reserve account with the Fed and credit the other bank's reserve account with the Fed. And so then, when the dust settles, they will no longer be in compliance with the legal reserve requirement. So that's where it comes in these FRB, examples that you had to learn when you took Econ 201 or something with, and then it lends out 90%, and then they do this and lends out 90%, is that's how the bank can be sure, even if this guy goes and spends it all right away, we don't get caught with our pants down. Like, that's why it had to be the step-by-step thing. But yeah, Carlos recognized in terms of just the principles and the reserve requirement, yeah, right out of the chute, you could lend the full amount if you wanted to, but it would just be reckless to do it because, like you're saying, Jonathan, once the other transactions start kicking in. So again, and Carlos was, full-blooded card-carrying fractional reserve banking in the Roth, theorist in the Rothbardian tradition there. He was just exculpating what he's found in Rothbard. Let me just, in fairness to Werner, though, he did say at the start of that clip that, economists don't have banks in their model. What the heck? He is right that a lot of macro economists in the mainstream don't. So Scott Sumner, who's like the Mercatus Institute's go-to guy on.
And this is why I get along with Austrians in the first instance, is because they do acknowledge the shortcomings of conventional economics, neoclassical economics, who to this day, their DSGE models do not have functional banks modeled into it, right? It's bizarre to me. And I don't know if Bob and Jonathan are going to get into, what are the effects of expanding credit in the economy, but I would suggest, and many other post-Keynesians would suggest, that credit is part of aggregate demand, right? And so we'll see if they get into that. What are the effects of credit expansion? It'll be interesting to see what they're taking.
Money and banking and the Great Depression and what caused the Great Recession and everything. He proudly says, I don't have banks in my model because he says you don't need it, right? Like, in other words, I'm above the fray. I'm the person who's really isolated. It's NGDP growth, period. And, you don't need banks. So, Werner's not attacking a straw man there, but I know maybe now Jonathan's where we can flash it. It is not true that the Austrian school doesn't have banks in their model, is it?
That's correct. So yeah, that was another thing. Probably the first thing that I responded to publicly after this interview is I just showed that.
I don't mean to stop, but Austrian economics doesn't have a formalized model. They have written text, right? And they describe, what their model is, but they don't formalize it. This is why I always suggest that they should get into system dynamics. So they don't have to precisely have exact data, right? They can design, a system dynamic model and see the behavior, like build a business cycle, see if their theory is correct structurally on the business cycle, right? And do stuff like that, but they don't have any of that. So it's pretty untestable to really take these guys serious in that regard. So when they say, well, we've got a model, it's like, I don't know, guys, right? Like, there are options now out there, as opposed to 50 years ago where you guys could formalize it with some basic math, like some ordinary differential equations, looking, at stocks and flows and putting some behavioral functions into that to kind of visualize your theory.
So I paraphrased Werner saying economists ignore banking, and then I showed the table of contents from Mises's 1912 book, The Theory of Money and Credit, originally published in German, and actually in Werner's History of Thought paper, he cites the theory of money and credit. And he also cites Hoppe, Holzman, and Bloch, their 1998 paper against fiduciary media. So Werner has been exposed to the Austrian school and has read at least parts of Mises because he quotes Mises in that paper. But I just showed that table of contents just so, yeah, Mises was on this as far back as 1912, and he showed how fiduciary media works, what fractional reserve banking does and means, and what are the consequences. I'm sure we'll get to Austrian business cycle theory at some point in this episode. But yeah, so I was just showing, and it wasn't just like back then. It's not like Austrians have forgotten about what Mises wrote about. Like, this has been a part of our tradition for over 100 years. So yeah, that critique applies to the mainstream, but definitely not to the Austrians.
Okay, well, that's good. So I need to go read his thing. I thought I probably looked at it years ago when somebody first, threw Werner in my face and said.
So one of my Austrian friends got me to read that Mises book, and I was quite shocked that there was a deep dive into that. So again, credit where credit's due. Like, there's a rich history of Austrian economics that you can read through, right, and get a perspective and kind of close the gap, especially between like the post-Keynesian school and the Austrian school, they're a lot closer. Now, their ideologies are far apart. Where does government fit in society? But their understanding of the economy, it's not that far apart, right? And I would hope, and this is what I've tried to do over the last year or so, is try to read a lot more of the Austrian literature to get an understanding of where they're really coming from, because we're hearing terms like straw manning a conversation and stuff. So I think it's just important to be a student of the game, the entire game of economics, and kind of read what you can read through. Give Bob some credit too. Like if there's a gateway drug to Austrian economics, it might be him, right? So check out some of his work.
Jason said, haha. Okay, so that's what I was going to say. I was going to give him an escape hatch, because he does say, even in that Tucker clip that we played, he's not claiming he invented credit creation theory circa 1989. Yep. He's saying this used to be known and then was buried by the CIA or whoever, and then now has come back because he resurrected it. So I guess you could say, in fairness, maybe he would say, oh, yeah, Mises knew about it. And I'm just saying nowadays that's been completely lost. And you could just say, well, don't you know about the Mises Institute? But okay, fair enough. So maybe I'm bristling too much to the guy. Okay, I have been burning too much time here. Let's go, folks. Let's get clip number 2 ready. Go ahead and let's play clip number 2.
Basically, the Bank of England was alchemy at work. You're creating money out of nothing, but not through the actual, physical alchemy process. It is the credit creation alchemy. Because banks create money out of nothing, but it's a trick. So what happened is this. When gold is money, and people think we need gold for transactions. One thing was the government's investing in, creating gold. But, that was of limited success. Now, the reality is, though, that people don't want for their transactions to carry gold around, because it's dangerous. I mean, even today, if you go around New York City, Manhattan, you don't really want to walk around with too much visible gold hanging around you,
Right.
It's kind of, in London, you wouldn't want to do it. And that's 21st century. So imagine, 15th, 16th century, 17th century, you don't really want to do that.
Bandits on the roads. No, not a good idea.
So what do you do?
Again, so I scanned through this interview with Tucker Carlson, and I just didn't find the interest in it, because it's just something I've known for a long time. It was no new information. So I just kind of watched that. I hadn't seen that clip. It's just quite interesting, the way he speaks. And I've said in the past, I love his work with commercial banks, but on topics like monetary policy, just go look at his Wikipedia page, right? And him talking about quantitative easing, right? He was kind of one of the founders of that in Japan many years ago.
Well, you put your money, your gold, where it's safe. Turns out there's some professions that were working with gold, and therefore they had safe places. They had their own little private security team, private army to watch their safe with the gold. And these are the goldsmiths. They make gold jewelry for the king and the aristocrats and the rich people. And so people started to deposit their gold with the goldsmith. Obviously, you need evidence. Like, what if something happens to the goldsmith and his son taking over the business denies that that's your gold? So clearly you need some receipt. Okay, so that was the convention. They got a little fee for safeguarding the gold. Fine, everyone's happy. But the next step is this. Let's say I'm, in the province, somewhere in Hampshire, in England, and we're neighbors, and we agree I'm buying this plot of land from you, and we agree on the price, and okay, how much gold? Fine. So what are we going to do next? Well, I've got the gold with a goldsmith in London. Okay, I will go and get the gold. By the way, what are you going to do with the gold? Because if you're not going to keep it here, then it's kind of dangerous. Like, I'm risking my life going to get the gold, bring it here, and then you bring it back to the goldsmith. We might as well leave it in the goldsmith, and I give you my deposit.
I don't want to hear about the goldsmith tale, right? We've all heard it before. We'll just keep going to where Bob and Jonathan comment, because I think that's the important part of reviewing this.
And also, secondly, if you measure the amount of gold at the goldsmith, did that increase? No. So that's fraud.
Okay, Jonathan, I have some stuff to say, but do you want to go first?
No, I went first last time. I'll let you take the lead on this one.
Okay. So here, obviously people, Rothbardians watching, but yeah. But let me, again, push back on this notion that this is, guys, come here. This is a secret that they don't want you to know about. The CIA buried this. Okay, watch this, folks. I'm going to show you some screenshots here. Okay, this is from a book called Modern Money Mechanics, not to be confused with Modern Monetary Theory. This is Modern Money Mechanics, a workbook on bank reserves and deposit expansion put out by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Now, when I end up showing you what they're going to talk about, you might think, oh, the Fed was formed in 1913. This must be from like 1916 or something, because Werner, in this Tucker interview explained how this was all quashed and nobody knew about this. This was forgotten 100 years ago, ancient wisdom that he resurrected in like 1991. But no, this book that I'm, about to quote from originally came out in 1961, right? And then it had subsequent, updates and whatever in 92 and so forth, right? So this is something that originally the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago plugged into, the New World Order or whatever, published in 1961, and then there were multiple updates, okay? And now let me just show you, with all that build up, you said, wow, this better be good. Oh, it will be. Okay, so early on, this is like page, I might be, this is like page 4 or 5 or something in this workbook, and the section's called Who Creates Money? And it starts out, changes in the quantity of money may originate with the actions of the Federal Reserve System. People are falling asleep. Yeah, that's what we think the government and the central banker control. But then you skip down 4 paragraphs. It started with goldsmiths. As early bankers, they initially provided safekeeping services, making a profit from vault storage fees for gold and coins deposited with them. People would redeem their deposit receipts whenever they needed gold or coins to purchase something and physically take the gold or coins to the seller, who in turn would deposit them for safekeeping, often with the same banker. Everyone soon found it was a lot easier simply to use the deposit receipts directly as a means of payment. These receipts, which became known as notes, were acceptable as money, since whoever held them could go to the banker and exchange them for metallic money. And then what I've highlighted, then bankers discovered that they could make loans merely by giving the promises to pay, or banknotes, to borrowers. In this way, banks began to create money. Okay, folks, so that is from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago in 1961 in a workbook for the public. As far as I know, the thing I'm just reading for is a PDF that's online. I don't think this was just an internal thing that they're saying, let's make sure the rubes don't get a hold of this. This is what we've been doing, right? So this is, again, so I'm trying to convey.
You notice how excited Austrians get when gold is mentioned, right? He found anybody that's read Modern Money Mechanics from the Fed. You've got to really dig through there and find that. So it's quite funny that, leave it to Bob to find a passage about the goldsmith's tale. It's quite funny.
I'm trying to be cheeky about it too, but what I'm trying to convey, folks, is a lot of what Werner was saying in there is, good stuff, and I'm glad that the word's getting out. But his constant refrain of, he even went so far, folks, in one part, we don't have it in the clips here, is to say someone from the CIA or someone from the U.S. government told him the CIA is watching you. Okay, I don't know whether that person was claiming to be from the CIA himself. In terms of, you got to stop telling everybody about how banks work and how they create money through credit creation and stuff by the mere act of granting loans, right? So I'm saying right there, it's not just saying banks create money, but they even went through the whole story of the goldsmiths and what happened step by step. The thing he just told Tucker, and Tucker's mind is getting blown. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago published that in 1961. Okay, Jonathan, go ahead.
Oh, no, yeah. I completely agree. This sort of story you can see in Rothbard's writings when he's talking about the history of money and banking. Mm-hmm. And so like this is not something that's like some brand new, shock and awe sort of discovery on the part of Werner. This idea that banks can create money through their fractional reserve, deposit and lending operations. There's an increase in the money supply. I know we were just talking about the 3 different.
They're not increasing credit because of what settlement balance they have with the Fed. I don't know why these guys keep saying that, right? It is the complete opposite, right? It's the expansion of credit that dictates the amount of settlement balances in the Fed system, right? So remember how I said credit expense and drives aggregate demand. Aggregate demand, more economic activity requires more settlement between banks, right? So I don't know why he keeps saying this. I don't know if there's a punchline coming up here. We'll keep watching.
Different theories, and there's some quibbles about which one is the most accurate description of what's going on. But like the idea that banks are creating money and that this originated with the actions of the Goldsmith bankers, it's like this is I guess I can't say it's common knowledge, but among economists, especially the economists that I work with and talk with, it's common knowledge. So this is not some sort of like earth-shattering thing.
Let's face it, 20 years ago, Austrians weren't talking about this. So I hate how they're moving the goalposts here. Go back 20 years, go back to the some original Twitter posts, right? And see if economists are even talking about this. Oh, it's all fractional reserve banking, fractional reserve banking, fractional reserve banking, right? There's no deep nuance on this. And yeah, Mises wrote about it. Maybe they should have took it more seriously. I don't know. But this is something new, right? This is a lot of pushback, I think, from the whole rise of modern monetary theory. Trust me, I've got my issues with them. I think this is a big pushback. Also, there is a documentary that, just for anybody that's interested, Jonathan Newman was kind of like the star in it, and it was kind of the pushback. I can't remember the name. Maybe somebody can put it in the comments after the live stream, where Austrians kind of did a pushback documentary to the MMT documentary, Finding the Money. And I always thought I had tried to reach out to Per Byland, I think. He's kind of like another one of he doesn't have a beard, so I don't know if he's like a full Austrian economist or not. And I often said, that they should do a documentary with him saying finding the value, because, Austrians are all about the value, right? The real wealth and all that stuff.
Thing. And I also think that it's doubtful that the CIA is, coming after him because he's revealing this, because as you mentioned, there are Federal Reserve documents that are explaining this same history. So like
I agree. If Warner is saying the CIA is coming after him, that's a bit out in left field. So with that, I agree. Whatever that was, I didn't watch the actual, like I said, I didn't watch the Tucker interview in its entirety. So if that's the case, well, that's pretty bizarre. Maybe that's worth a video in itself.
if the CIA is against Werner, then the CIA is also against the Federal Reserve. Now that would be a movie that I would like to see, is like some fighting between
what
the
next?
CIA
The CIA against the sitting president in the 1960s? I think not. And also, just to clarify, you're right, John. I don't mean folks to say, oh yeah, you would have to go to this 1960. This is just chock. Rothbard and Mises' writings are replete with this stuff. But given that we earlier gave a nod to maybe what Werner has in mind is, oh yes, these obscure, marginalized Austrians who don't have any prominent academic posts anymore. They're just a chapter of the history of. Yeah, they still talk about this stuff, but I'm talking to show that he can't merely be saying that. I'm saying Federal Reserve Bank itself explained all of this and gave that same Goldsmith history back in 1961 and has published multiple updates of that document throughout the decades. Okay, so again, I'm just the reason I picked them and not something from Rothbard's What is Government.
Yeah, you're correct, Bob. Everybody's been talking about money creation. So the narrative here is that Mises was the first. We knew about that stuff so long ago. Why are we even talking about it? Then they never talked about it, right? They bring up, the Federal Reserve was talking about it. They weren't talking about it then. This is a very recent phenomenon for Austrian economics to be having this discussion, because it goes against the rigid ideology that it's the Fed driving the business cycle. That's what this comes down to, essentially, is that any idea that money creation's driving settlement balances as opposed to the opposite flies into the face of the Austrian business cycle, adjusting interest rates, different balances in Fed accounts, right? And so that's the big pushback that we're seeing kind of from Bob and Jonathan here and many other Austrians. But you're correct, Bob. Many economists knew this for a long time. It wasn't formalized. If you read the Mises chapter on this, it wasn't like this was like some deep detail right? And he was going into it, and like there was a huge insight out of the Austrian school about this. He acknowledged it, like many other schools acknowledged it long ago. But it wasn't until further down the line in endogenous money theory that it was really flushed out. And you got to give Richard Warner some credit. He went, and this is what Dr. Mike Radzicki says. I do live streams with him every Friday. We're back this Friday with Steve Keen. He says, you know what economists need to do the most is actually go out in the field and learn how the economy works, right? And so I doubt Mises was at a bank asking a loans officer at the time, you know, as he was writing this book, right? But he was a smart guy and he knew it. He could put the math together, right? So you're absolutely correct. There's no major insight from anybody specifically, but you've got to give Richard the credit. He's coming out and formalizing and putting it out there to a wider audience, and that's credit where credit's deserved.
Government done to our money or something is to show this is not some heterodox, obscure thing that only, you know, post-Keynesians and Austrians know about. Okay, we're going to get ready to play clip 3 here, folks. Let me just set this up a little bit.
I just finished saying that Austrians were aware of money creation, that Mises wrote about it, right? So I'm not saying that. They just weren't talking about it, right? They're not talking about it in the depth that people that work in endogenous money theory have talked about it, right? And how it adds to aggregate demand, right? So they're not really talking about that per se, right? And if they do talk about it, it's a very abstract way and it's not formalized, right? And so it's really what ought to be conversation, right? Relative to the Austrian business cycle theory, not what's actually happening in the economy right now.
Jonathan, this is the one that's going to be a surprise for you. I was intrigued by what Werner just said there when he's telling the goldsmith story and how the bookkeeping worked. And so it is kind of neat, right? When you're really trying to understand, he was trying to isolate the fraud involved and how something screwy is going on. And again, just folks to explain.
I guess I'll stop for this question. So in our national model at Modern Macro Technology, we don't just simply say, oh, because the employment ratio goes up, it's the function's an exponential and wages go up. We actually kind of go back to the original Bill Phillips paper, right? And Bill Phillips never suggested this automatic trade-off between unemployment and inflation. It's a lot deeper, right? So we're looking at imports and exports, productivity, right? Those types of things, labor population growth, so the available labor. So it's actually quite a detailed, nuanced version of what Steve did. But Steve, if you look deep in his papers, actually tackled all that and really went at the heart of what Phillips was doing. In his little toy models that he'll maybe demonstrate on YouTube, he just kind of leaves that out for simplicity and says there's a relationship between the employment ratio rising. So it's the inverse of unemployment. So as the employment ratio rises, so there's more workers needed than there are in workers available. So that population's not growing as fast. So the ratio goes up. That means there's more wage increased demand. And that's how he models it in a simplistic way. But of course, it's far more nuanced than that. And you can kind of look through Steve's deeper work and find that.
Explain, to paraphrase what his story to Tucker there was, some original people deposit actual physical gold, back in the days when gold coins were the money. And the bankers give them notes, saying, we acknowledge you deposited this amount of weight, of gold into our vaults. And at any time, this note allows you to redeem it. And so that person can now go around town spending those notes as being the same thing as money, because the merchants realize, oh yeah, if I wanted the gold coin, I would just go down to the goldsmith and hand this note. Okay. But then now that the goldsmith has a lot of metal, yellow metal sitting in his vault, somebody needs to borrow money, and he goes ahead and does the transaction and says, here, technically, let me take the gold out, give you a bag of coins. You're signing the IOU, blah, 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 or I'm going to charge you, 16% interest per annum, blah, 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 blah. And now, you know what, as part of the deal, give me that bag of coins back. I'm going to go put it back in the vault and close the door. And here's the note, right? And so he's saying in terms of the double entry bookkeeping, it all looks, above board and everything, but it's, obviously something's crazy going. That guy's walking around back into town now with notes saying, I just deposited these gold coins when he didn't start out with them. So something's fishy, right? So I actually, Jonathan, I went and dug up I found an old video on YouTube from more than 10 years ago of, I think it's Werner, I'm not sure, but there in the example he goes through is talking about gold coins and deposits, and he goes through step by step.
I'm still baffled by why they go back to this gold standard thing. I guess this is where Warren Mosler really gets the idea that Austrian economics is incompatible with a free floating exchange fiat currency, and maybe he's right, because they constantly go back to an example that's not part of our current economy. I don't know what relative impact. I guess he's commenting on what Richard is saying, and which I have already stated. I don't like Richard in the monetary authority kind of realm. I think he's way off base in that department, and I appreciate more his commercial banking takes.
With the bookkeeping involved in terms of the double entry bookkeeping, how this thing works, and one of the examples, it's like it starts out original guy deposits, I think it's 100 ounces of gold, and then this guy Guido shows up and borrows 90. So I'm assuming, because Guido's kind of a weird name, that this must be Werner. That's the only explanation I can find. He looks a little different, but again, this video that I found was from a while ago. So folks, just to pace yourself mentally, this is a 4-minute clip. Let's go ahead and play clip 3 of how what Werner just said there, sort of intuitively to Tucker, was unpacked in terms of the actual accounting and bookkeeping.
So what I'm saying in this slide here, look at this carefully. There's still 100 ounces of gold in the vault, and the bankers are still counting that as assets. And now, on top of that, the bankers are counting the 90-ounce IOU from Guido as an asset, too. Because in their mind, they're saying, no, this is a legally binding contract he just signed with us, and he's a smart guy. He's going to come up with the money. Even if that weird book he's writing doesn't pan out, he's probably going to just go shake somebody down for it, so we're going to get paid. So this is clearly an asset. And we still have the 100 ounces in the vault. And the way these fractional reserve bankers work, they think money in the vault is our money. We can, that's our asset. So the asset side is 190. So we know, because of the double entry bookkeeping, it's got to be the case that the liabilities and shareholder equity have to equal 190. And so where does that come in? Well, right now there's still no equity. Okay, because nothing is, all the bank has done is made a loan. That per se doesn't earn them income. They earn income over time through interest.
There is a younger version of Bob Murphy there. I wonder how old, Bob, if you ever see this video or kind of look at this live stream, put in the comments how old you were there. Maybe, what are you, about 40? Because I'm 41 right now, and I'm just looking at the hair situation. I was actually having a grok choke, because I think it's the choke AI. I was actually having a conversation with Grok about Bob Murphy and production and stuff like that. It wasn't really about Bob Murphy, and we came up at so I should start a school called post haircutism. Anyways, and I think it was because Bob Murphy was involved there. But there's young Bob. He does look a lot younger there. Good old Bob. I actually really like Bob. I like his takes, right? And I gotta say, if I had a choice to listen between, let's say, Paul Krugman and Bob Murphy, I would listen to Bob Murphy all day, right? He's just a wealth of information. I don't agree with all his takes. Obviously, I'm doing this video, but he is an historian of economics, and it is focused on the Austrian Mises side of things. But Jesus, he is a smart guy. But anyways, we'll carry on with the video.
Through interest accrual. So right now, at the moment of giving that loan to Guido, they haven't earned anything. So where that 190 comes from on the right-hand side is the fact that Billy still thinks the bank, that he has a claim on the bank of 100 ounces of gold. And at any time he wants to, he can either write checks or he can show up and withdraw his money. So when the bank, legally speaking, wants to say, what are our liabilities? Well, Billy has the right to withdraw 100 ounces of gold, but so does Guido. Okay? So it's true, Guido didn't walk out of the bank. He didn't want to walk out with 90 ounces in metal, but he could have if he wanted to. And now with his checking account, if he wants to, he can go to a bank and write it out to cash. If you've ever done that, if you write a check out to cash and give it to the bank, they give you cash for it. Okay, so he can do that if he wants. It's just he doesn't want to do that right now. And in any event, if he writes checks to merchants in the community, then this bank is going to be obligated if the people who get those checks want to hand over physical gold. Okay, so now.
So logical saying here, Austrians have been internally debating about whether banks should be legally allowed to create money. You even mentioned the debate between Bob Murphy and George Elgin on this very topic. I haven't actually wrote a whole blog about it. Very interesting to watch those two go. Um, Here's the thing, like our modern economy and the productivity we've seen since, let's say, 1970, and we're not discounting that. I'm not discounting that. I believe that the growth of the financial sector has caused the collapse in the income share for households. Right, they're simply have grown and taken a share of that income away from households, not productive firms. Right, and so I have issues with the financial sector growing. As for the elasticity of money, it is been essentially an innovation, right, to allow the American economy to grow into the superpower economic of the world, or economic superpower of the world. Getting really dyslexic here, and so for me, it's not a debate, right? It's in fact, so a lot of people ask me, "Are you a free market type guy? Are you a government interventionist type guy?" I'm probably more of a free market type guy, and that's why. And so I've even had debates with Steve Keen, which is a mentor to me, where he would advocate that, under certain conditions, maybe it's more appropriate to have CBDCs, a central bank currency, right? And maybe bypass commercial banking altogether and their ability to create funds. But I would say that is as free market as it gets, right? If you have an opportunity as a business and you go to a bank and it's worthy enough that the loans officer trusts you, they expand credit and we expand our economy. That's expanding aggregate demand, right? So, and that's not to say that banks, and what's happening now is problematic, is banks are going after, second mortgages, right? And that's for non-productive means, right? When I ran a small trucking business when I was in my mid 20s, and so that was 16 years ago. It was incredibly hard to get a line of credit for a small business from the banks where they expand credit for me. And so I have problems with there's not that capital expansion for productive means of the economy. Now, as I grew and I showed tax records, eventually I could get some lines of credits and some loans, and I expanded my business. And it did good. I hired more people, right? It added to aggregate demand because I would take those funds and employ idle resources in the economy that weren't being used, right? And the economy would grow and there'd be people employed, right? So I get that. I get that debate, right? But I'm firmly on the side that banks need the elasticity of currency and no barriers in the way of that.
The assets and liabilities are 190 ounces. So when we talk about, so notice what happened here is the bank's balance sheet expanded or grew because of granting the loan to Guido. And that's why I did it this way. I didn't want, because probably most of you, when you hear examples like this, you're thinking, okay, first there's 100 ounces in the vault, and then they took out 90 and gave it to Guido, and he walked away. But what I'm trying to isolate and show you is no, the first thing that happens conceptually in terms of the accounting is the mere granting of a loan to Guido all of a sudden increases both sides of the balance sheet. And to the extent that Guido may not.
I don't know what Bob's going on about here. He's mixing in gold stuff again and hypotheticals. I don't know what really this has to do with Richard's interview, but I'm sure there's a punchline here. I'm waiting, Bob.
Withdraw the money, then at that point in time, in that period, the money supply or the money stock in this community is now bigger. And what do I mean? Well, I'm saying to the extent that we consider checking account balances or demand deposit balances part of the money supply or the money stock, clearly it's gone up by 90 ounces. So if Billy is the only person in the community originally, it's gone up by 90%. Now, of course, there's a lot other money in the economy.
So there's a third part, and we'll play. It's about 15 minutes long. And here's Bob making a comment. So Simmons in the 1930s argued that commercial banks should not be permitted to create money, as that was a government function. And so there was a time where I was actually a little more libertarian, and this is in the mid 2000s. And I often argued the only thing the government should be involved in is money creation. But then as I learned like economics and macroeconomics and like the structure of the economy, I realized how dangerous that was politically. Okay. And you look at the example of Trump right now down in the States. You think Trump could put a treasury secretary in power that could handle monetary policy and how that would trickle down to, let's say, reserve banks that essentially became commercial banks, right? Um, it would become a political decision if a person got a loan or not, right? So it's in a utopia type world. Let's say we lived in a Star Trek and we had credits, and I know Star Trek's kind of back and forth on did they have credits or there was no credits and everybody just worked for the betterment of the community around them. But in some scenarios in Star Trek there were these credits, right? In a utopia situation, sure, okay, we could trust our government to have a perfect elasticity of whatever unit of credit we're using, so it would benefit mankind, or your community or your nation for economic expansion or economic prosperity. And in this day and age, and Trump's an example, I don't see how that's possible. But on the flip side, we are saying, and I'm advocating at this point that we are allowing private institutions to handle that, right? On the basis of profit motive. And we know that profit motive is not always on the side of the public purpose, right? And of course, the public purpose is quite a divisive topic anyways. What is the public purpose? Like a majority of people want this, so that's what the public should get, or somehow we have democratic systems in place where the minority is acknowledged and they get a portion of something, right? So that's very subjective. And of course, the profit motive system, the capitalist system, is always not going to address that at all. It's going to address it from a profit motive, right? So it's not an ideal system. But when you think about tyranny and government tyranny, it becomes very problematic that you would have, let's say, the government controlling the creation of money and driving that, right? Because we know empirically that aggregate demand is the most credit creation is the most volatile portion of aggregate demand. And what that is so aggregate demand, where we want to really have it focused on, is investment into real capital. So there's expansion in our economy. So it is a tough like noodle to crack, what's better. And I would suggest at this point, based on political behavior around the world and the rise of populism, that it would be very dangerous to give absolute control to a political party over something so important as money. And right now we could say there is a blend. So the government, when it spends and the Fed purchases assets from government assets, that creates reserve. So there's a kind of a government component there, and then you have got a commercial private sector component, which are commercial banks. That's kind of the best blend we can have at this point. And if we become more enlightened as a society, which that's debatable, then we could think about a credit system where we give to a political group that we all agree is in the best interest for society. We'll play the last 15 minutes here. I think I'm not going to do these long reaction videos anymore. I think I keep it much shorter because I've had to play all this because I wanted everybody to hear what Bob and Jonathan were saying. In fairness to them, I didn't want to clip, like I skipped the Warren parts or the Richard Warner parts because that was kind of a different video. I didn't want to clip out parts from Bob and Jonathan and be unfair to them. I want to react to exactly what they said. And I'm hoping at this point, I'm not hearing any punchlines here. I'm just hearing the Austrian opinion and the same old, same old. There's nothing really controversial here. They have a strong belief that fractional reserve banking is driving the business cycle, if I could summate it in those terms. So we'll just carry on with the next part.
Oh, shoot. I meant to verify. I think they rebooted those. I think that's actually still, I think you can still get it. I'll check. But by the time you're seeing this, folks, we'll put a link in if that's a thing, if you can go watch it. But any event, that is, we gave like a sample, right? So that particular lecture they pulled and they posted on YouTube. and that's got like 19,000 views or something. And I just go through it. So the context there is that was the third one. I originally went through the bookkeeping of just standard loan banking, like to show if they really were just financial intermediaries, how's that work? And also what I do, folks, is I show how does the banker, earn income over time so they do increase their equity, right? So there's a way that the banks profit from this practice, but the point is they can't just give loans to themselves because you don't earn income from the granting of a loan. It's got to be over time. It's the interest income. Okay. So obviously my point there, folks, was to say, you notice how there's a lot of similarity between what I just went through there and what Werner's telling Tucker. Psst, come here, let me tell you what they don't want you to know. I'm the first person to really blow the lid open on this. I mean, so you can see maybe why some of us are like, come on, dude. All right. Anything else you want to say, Jonathan, besides noting the amount of sun?
I gotta say, that old video clip of Bob there, that's a stretch to say that he's describing anything. Even in the clips I watched of Richard, that was far more nuanced than what Bob was saying there. And that was Bob talking about, ounces of gold and notes being issued. So I think that's a bit of a stretch there, Bob, that you've been, on the money 10 years ago on this, because that's not really the context of that video.
Yeah. Amount of sunlight that was, or overhead light that was bouncing off my head there.
I did notice that, but I wasn't going to call attention to it. But I mean, another funny thing that's happened is that while I guess the CIA didn't call you after this video, what do you think there was any sort of like implicit message in the WEF highlighting your book, Understanding Money Mechanics? It's like, hey, we're watching you, that sort of thing.
I don't think so. So, folks, what he's talking about is my most recent, what I'll put in a note in the show notes page too. For the Institute, I wrote this book called Understanding Money Mechanics. And, of course, we go through all this stuff in that book as well. And the World Economic Forum, the Klaus Schwab thing before he stepped down, that was.
I'm still waiting for the punchline of this video. I think it's getting to the point where it's going to be, we basically agree with everything he said. We've just been saying it longer. I think that's what's going to happen in this video. So logical. What about giving everyone a constitutional right to banking and then have the government create new money and distribute it equally between everyone as a UBI? No government abuse, and it's fair. In a perfect, so there's the big debate between on the progressive side between a federal job guarantee and a universal basic income, which I think, in a perfect world, they complement each other and you'd have basic services. So like up here in Canada, we have healthcare, right? And I can't really understand how the US, the economic superpower of the world, it doesn't have like a proper healthcare system. And, the public system has its issues. But anyways, you should have basics. So it's kind of the triad of social services. And so UBI is the easiest one to implement because you're just cutting checks to people. And of course, people that are opposed to it say, well, that's extremely inflationary. But the reality is that just giving somebody money, if they spend it, it becomes the profits of the firm. A portion of the firm's profits after, share buybacks and paying their employees and CEOs getting big chunks of money is ultimately it goes into capital investment and it grows the economy. Right. So in that sense, I've always said, a UBI, so long as it's properly proportioned, right, it might grow over time with some sort of a cost of living standard, right? Tie it in with that could work. But the problematic thing is you get people in like Trump who would just cut it, right? So there's no sustainability and there's no stability with a program like that because it could just be cut. Now you've got people that have become financially dependent. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just they've integrated that, let's say, portion of income that they would get each month, and then they lose it, right? And what kind of instability would that cause to the economy? So I am in favor of a UBI so long as it's, very structured, right? And it's geared correctly. It can work along with a job guarantee. So I'm not opposed to that, but even like constitutionally, like we are seeing that right now, like the constitutional rights of individuals that are coming into the US, whether they do it legally or illegally. Trump is really, really pushing against those norms, right? So that's where I kind of was suggesting that Bob, yeah, these are great ideas, and the idea of a foundationally sound government controlling money, that would be great in a utopia, but I just don't think we're there yet. And then, of course, the question becomes, if we're not there yet, and we know we're not there yet as a society, does that preclude us, saying too many words, does that stop us from actually trying, right? Is that a justification? Well, we shouldn't try progressive ideas because we know our government is not stable. It's not going to be in power long enough. Some dictator might come along, right? Trump might come along, so we shouldn't even bother trying, right? And that's a tough noodle to crack. So I just kind of look at the causal effects and look at it, the yo-yo we're going with political parties right now, especially down in the States, and how divided things are. Is it really applicable to have a great system, let's say like a UBI for 4 years, and then it's gone, right? What kind of instability, political instability does that cost? And what kind of financial instability does it cost? So I'm not opposed to that idea. I always look at things, and like when I'm modeling, that's why I kind of stay out of the ideology, is I just look at how is the world now? Like, how is the economic system now, right? And I try to steer away from the political part because it really freaking complicates great ideas like a UBI, like government having sound money, right? Et cetera, et cetera.
That was all the rage, you will own nothing and be happy, we'll make you eat the bugs and all that stuff. When they were coming out, and they had like a quick video on their YouTube page explaining like, oh, new books to check out, and they were going through it, and one of them was mine, highlighting it. And so of course a ton of people were sending that to me, either laughing and thinking that was hilarious, or wondering like, Bob, what's your deal? Like, how come the WF is pushing your book? I don't know what to tell. I mean, so I know, and I don't have any inside story. Obviously, if I were working for them, I wouldn't tell you guys. But my guess is, Jonathan, it was just some like low level staffer that just thought, oh no, this guy does a good job explaining stuff, and our people want to know how banks work, and so there you go. So that's my innocuous explanation. Okay, folks,
you haven't seen like black Ford Explorers or black trucks and helicopters flying over.
I guess what I could do is just every bad thing that has happened and why I'm not as popular and I'm not yet the multimillionaire that I think I really ought to be given my talents. It's because behind the scenes, the CIA has just been.
See what he ought to be, right? There's a mindset in Austrian economics that I will postulate is a big factor, right? It's a normative branch of economics. What ought to be, like, we know the answer because of historical ratings from Mises or Hayek or some of the other characters, right? And the world's what is the world now, right? Does the world now, is that ought that you're suggesting be the ought that was in the past? Now I know Bob there is joking about his book, and I'm happy you got a mention there, and hopefully there's no black SUVs in the CIA outside his house. I hope that's not happening to Bob.
Blocking me and doing all sorts of stuff. Okay, we got one more clip for you folks. Clip number 4, please, Mr. Engineer, and we will then discuss and wrap this thing up.
So in principle, banks get their return from the difference between the interest they pay on deposits and the interest they earn on their lending. But the key thing is that for the actual lending, they're not really giving up intrinsic resources because they're creating new money. So it's actually easy for them to earn this
all
money.
fake.
But it is, there's technicalities, and you have to do it properly. It doesn't mean, you can be careless. And sometimes when they are careless, it blows up and we have banking problems, and banking crises. But the regular banking crises are mainly when banks create credit for asset purchases. And that's what creates these boom-bust cycles. In the UK, bank credit, 85% of bank credit is for asset purchases. And so you get these asset boom-bust cycles, banking crises in regular intervals. In some other countries, I haven't mentioned the third scenario now. So bank credit for asset purchases, no good. It's not sustainable. It's not productive. Credit creation for consumption, it's for the real economy, but it's for consumption. Therefore, it's inflationary. It's also no good. It's not sustainable. The third possibility is the redeeming feature of banking, and that's one.
So I disagree with it. I don't think lending for consumption is as productive as simply lending for productive firms. But you have to understand the only reason you're assuming, right, that if you look at it in a system dynamic way, it's just a circular feedback loop, right? So if you're consuming, profits go up, right? That's a signal to firms to invest more in their capital, right? That produces more output, more employment, right? And more income. People consume more, right? So to suggest, I think there's a lag, right? There's like when I model in our big, huge national model with thousands of equations, right? There is a lag, but it's not, it gives money to households, right? So that, and now that form comes out of credit cards at this point, right? Banks aren't saying, well, here's a loan, here's a $10,000 loan for your groceries for a while, right? They might get a mortgage, right? But that mortgage is predicated on something, right? So I disagree with him saying that in a blanket statement. I hope maybe he nuances it a little bit more, but you have to realize that, you know, investment is what drives the business cycle, not consumption, right? Consumption is a residual of the business cycle, right? It all comes from investment. So profits go up, and like I said before, a portion of those profits are used for share buybacks. And I would argue that share buybacks is just a future form of investment in itself with a lag, because it lowers the dividend payments for firms in aggregate and they end up investing more in the future. But that's another story, right? So as investment into real capital goes up, firms can utilize more real resources and create more real output, creating more employment, right? And of course, if you have more demand in employment versus the growth of your employment population, then nominal wages are going up and households are better off. But ultimately, consumption is very stable, right? And it's primarily driven, and this is all the studies we've done at Modern Macro Technology, by bank balances, right? Neoclassicals have a Euler's equation that dictates consumption, but it's kind of foolish stuff. Really, it's a time constant on your bank balance, right? So in aggregate, if bank balances go up, obviously consumption goes up, but it's very stable in that regard. And investment drives it. And investment is derived from profits, right? And loans to firms. But profits can be derived from household consumption. And if you're lending to households so they consume, well, that just pushes up profits.
We can turn banking into a very positive, very powerful positive force for creating prosperity and abundance. Namely, when banks create credit for productive business investment, for the investment in the production of goods and services, implementing new technologies, implementing new ideas. It's actually the driving factor for growth and prosperity when banking supports entrepreneurs that implement new things. And that's when you get very high economic growth without inflation, without asset inflation. And so really what we should do is bank credit creation should be mainly only for business investment. But this is not what regulators do. Regulators now have not just hundreds, they have thousands of rules for banks. And banking is the most regulated industry on the planet. Most of them are useless. They don't achieve the goal of preventing banking crises. For that, we can scrap all these rules. We just need one rule, that banks should only be allowed to create credit if it contributes to national income through business investment.
So as long as the fraud is done in a socially approved way that helps everybody, then it's fine.
Yeah. So this is where I was thinking, I wish he had read more of Mises's theory of money and credit. Although I'm not sure like how obvious it is. Like,
is it fraud if it's socially acceptable? Right. So at this point, if it's socially acceptable, and it's a loose term, then it's fraud because you say it's fraud. I don't know if there's an argument there.
It is like if you just do like a first read, do you really get all the ins and outs of Austrian business cycle theory? But what he's describing there, but by the way, I agree with him about bank regulations. Sometimes they're onerous. Sometimes that leads to like less productive lending. So there's a lot of agreement there. But then when it comes down to this prescription that we should restrict banks and say that they can only make loans for business investment, it's got to be this profitable, productive, encouraging employment, stimulating national income, these sorts of things. Like he's basically just described what Mises pointed out as what starts the business cycle. So I guess he's sort of thrown out this interest rate issue. And in fact, elsewhere in the interview, he just sort of like disregards interest rates.
But he sort of mocks it, like, oh, that's another red herring that a lot of the mainstream is going to tell you that interest rates have something to do with credit flows. No, they don't.
But the idea is that when the bank is increasing the supply of loans to businesses, so let's just like think through what happens if we adopt his prescription. When the bank increases the supply of money, increases the supply of credit, and offers it to banks, that pushes down the interest rate. That increases the supply of loanable funds. If you just think about the typical Garrisonian graphs, increases the supply, interest rate comes down. And now, what does this do to entrepreneurs? Like, what do entrepreneurs see? What do they think? How do they respond to this? And the answer is they
There's no statistical evidence that happens when banks expand credit, that market rates are going down, right? There's so the primary reason what drives market rates, and the Austrians will agree with this, is the Fed can set the interbank rate, lending rate, so the Fed funds rate. And now, in modern terms, the way they do that is they have a floor, which is interest on reserves, and a ceiling, which is the discount window, where a bank can go and get an overnight loan for reserves from the central bank itself. And then between that, the interbank rate will float depending on between bank, what they decide on those terms of the loan, based on the amount of settlement balances in the system, right? So it's all controlled by the Fed. And so it's a floor on all rates that are further downstream. Rates beyond that in aggregate are just driven on what inflation expectations are going to be. And so I don't mean that in a neoclassical expectation way, but just simply a lag on reacting to what inflation is. So it's just a markup on economic activity. I know the Austrians say, well, inflation, it's the Milton Friedman version of inflation, more money out there chasing fewer goods. But if you look at it statistically, inflation is driven by the business cycle itself, economic activity. More economic activity pushes up inflation, right? You can look at it over and over, and there's permutations that what might knock that around. But if you look at it in aggregate, that's how it functions. So I will discuss this as we listen.
They take the funds because they're cheaper. There's more funds available. They take these funds and they start new lines of production. They buy new capital goods. They make new capital goods. And what Mises pointed out is that when they're doing this, they're not just increasing productivity. So it sounds like new capital goods that increases productivity, starting new lines of production. This is good for employment. This is good for national income. But what Mises pointed out is they're making specific capital goods, and the sorts of lines of production that they're starting are ones that are longer than we can actually finish. So there's a certain amount of saved resources. There's a certain amount of capital that we have available to us. Yes, we can move things around. We can start to make different capital goods. We can start these new longer lines of production. But ultimately, the real resources aren't there to actually complete these projects. And so you get into the middle of them, and you find that
at one point they're bringing up risk assessments for banks, and now they're saying, well, banks are just lending willy-nilly, and they're not looking at the business plan for a loan to a firm. And so they're ignoring, well, that firm doesn't have the real resources out there. We're going to lend the money anyways, right? Or maybe this is what Mises is saying. And that is, again, statistically in the real world now is not happening, right? So there are extensive corporate business plans, right, of how they're going to procure the resources, right, for a capital investment. And it's sequentially what happens, right, the type of output that comes out. So I blanketly disagree. This is just a theoretical fuckery at this point out of Jonathan Smart Guy, but there's no empirical evidence to back up what he's saying.
The capital is more scarce. And I mean, like, like physical capital goods, like the capital goods that you need to finish these projects just doesn't exist. So their prices increase. These new lines of production that appeared profitable now they realize that they will not be profitable. So they abandon the projects, they liquidate, they lay off their workers. And we have this, crisis, we have this bust or the recession period where we need to
So he's trying to describe an economic system with micro foundations, right? And so, firms, there's malinvestment in specific firms. But if you look at the economy in aggregate, look at the .com bubble, right? The internet just didn't disappear, right? It was retooled, right? All those capital investments, right, were retooled. And we got, things down the line like MySpace and Facebook and Twitter. Now there's a debate on the productivity that gives to the economy. It's helped me, right? It's grown my Patreon account by promotion and whatnot. But to suggest that that all the economy's operating in aggregate in this malinvestment, that's fallacious in itself. It never happens. We retool capital that doesn't find its immediate productivity gains, right? And it's tooled into something more productive. We're not just taking hammers to our capital equipment after, the first project for one specific firm didn't work. So break it down, right? There's a secondary markets, right? And these things are resold, right? So in aggregate, there's really no such thing as malinvestment, right? Even if you look at AI right now and what we saw AI to be, in 2016 and what it is now, right? It's constantly being retooled. There's never a situation where it could be malinvestment, right? The productivity will be found. The free market will find that productivity for it. So again, categorically, I don't know what the hell Jonathan's talking about.
Need to correct those mistakes. So the very thing that he's prescribing is what Mises cautioned against and said, no, we can't do this. By the way, I completely agree with him. You can have, bank credit expansion that turns into like this big asset bubble, or it can cause, like a simple inflation if it just goes to consumer loans and they run up, credit card debt as a response. But the specific channel that Mises explained is what results in a business cycle where we have these big macroeconomic swings is when that credit creation, the money creation is channeled through credit markets to business investment, and they start these projects that can't be completed. So here he just needs to do his homework. He needs to finish the Theory of Money and Credit. I know he's read at least parts of it, and think through all of the consequences of allowing banks to do this sort of thing.
Yeah, great stuff.
Got to finish your homework. If you don't know Austrian economics, then you need to finish your homework. I question how much Jonathan's really read like the deep parts of Keynes, right? Yeah, I've perused through the general theory, but did he read the general theory of employment in 1937? Arguably a far more nuanced paper, a set of papers that came out 2 years after the general theory. This is getting into what you ought to do without any substance.
Great stuff. I'll just be real quick here and we'll wrap up, folks. Just to elaborate a bit on what you said there, Werner, one of the things he's known for is he has this idea of disaggregating the credit flows and to distinguish between our banks, this new credit they're creating, is it fueling asset purchases or is it like going to households and they're using it to buy gasoline and tuna fish? And so to understand what type of credit inflation is going to cause what the public thinks of as inflation, meaning like, oh, gee, I go to the grocery store and stuff's more expensive. You need to know where's the new credit flowing. And so I think that's a good contribution that he made or a good distinction he's drawing. And it does help to explain, you told me before, Jonathan, I need to stop apologizing for it, but some of us worried about the rounds of QE and we're thinking, oh, that's going to, that's going to cause consumers to see higher price inflation at the store. And it didn't. And so, yes, that looking more carefully at the flows and things, because in other words, QE did cause prices to go up, but it caused like the price of mortgage-backed securities and the price of treasuries and the price of, stocks in the S&P 500 to go up. It didn't cause tuna fish to, go up by 5 times. So there's that element. And I think, he does a good job. We don't have the clips here, but when he's talking to Tucker about that and doing the MV equals PY stuff, and that's where he gets into all that, the failure of standard monetarism. And, Milton Friedman was lamenting in the early 80s, like, oh, geez, V is unpredictable, and it kind of screws up my model as a quantity monetary theorist or monetarist. Okay, so that's all good stuff. But yeah, on this thing right here and elsewhere, he talks about too, like, oh yes, we want the public authorities to be control of the money, and that's what. And again, for all the reasons you don't want the backroom bankers with their cigar-filled rooms making deals and fraudulently creating money that doesn't exist and lending it out to the wrong people. For all those reasons, you also don't want them, quote, lending to the right people either. That in a standard, in the Rothbardian sense, even though Rothbard understands the credit creation and money creation dynamics, he thinks that's fraudulent, just like it seemed 10 minutes ago Werner agreed. And so if something is fraudulent, you should probably stop it, right? You don't need systematic fraud for a healthy economy. And so if banks merely acted as credit intermediaries where households genuinely saved, that would free up real resources that aren't being devoted to producing consumption goods and can shift then into investment goods. That's how it's all internally consistent and sustainable. So in Werner's framework, the last point I'll make here, folks, is
So there is, if you want to have a loanable funds model, and you reduce the funds of the household to increase the funds of the firm, but now you've reduced the profits of the firm because you've reduced the income of the household. It's not a very functioning. So it can work in a small community where you're loaning beads back and forth or something like that. But in a modernized economy, it's pretty it's inelastic essentially, right? So would be a terrible idea to ever go to a system like that.
yeah, you've got all these local community banks or whatever spread around the country. This is, I don't have it in the clips, but that's what he's telling Tucker. The right thing to do is when Deng Xiaoping went to Japan and they gave him the secret to sustainable high economic growth over the decades. It's, don't have all the power of credit creation vested in the one Bank of China. You got to distribute it to the local banks and have, them making loans because they got their feet on the ground and they, can give it to the local hardware store that nobody's heard of, but that's what you need for, sustainable. But how is the local hardware store getting the lumber to build the building and getting all the tools and everything if households haven't genuinely cut back on their consumption, right? That there's physical processes involved. It's not merely bookkeeping operations. And so that's what is the genius of me.
He's kind of got it ass backwards there, right? If households cut back on their consumption, then firms don't have a profit, right, to invest in their capital equipment to make the consumption that for households to buy. And that's a negative reinforcing loop, right? So it's just a downward spiral. The whole idea that it's an either or choice is very static thinking, right? So if you look at it in a complex system, right, you see those interactions over time, and of course you get the business cycle. Firms need households to use the resources that firms produce, right? It's not the households are using too much on consumption goods, right? Those consumption goods were created by the capital goods, right? And firms will earn a profit if the households are consuming those goods created by capital goods, consumer goods. So households are consuming the consumer goods, turns up as profit for the firms. Firms are like, well, okay, this is great. We're going to invest more in our capital equipment, right? What he's suggesting is that we're always at peak capacity in what we're utilizing in the economy. And that's not the case. We're never at peak. So if you look at capital utilization rate in the United States, it hovers around 75 to 80%, right? So there's always spare capacity, right? Now, if he's arguing, which I know he's not, Bob's not a global climate change type of guy. If he's arguing a limits to growth situation, I'd be on board. So if you guys ever look at the limits to growth, and right, there is, a peak of the amount of resources that we can use, and it impacts population and everything else down the line. I'd buy into that, but that's not the argument he's making right now. He's making a mutually exclusive argument between either capital goods or consumption goods, but they're one and the same. They're part of that dynamic cycle. You can't have one without the other, right? So carry on with the last few minutes.
Mises and his theory of the credit cycle is that he realized that, yes, he, back in 1912, he explained how banks create money through the act of granting loans over and above their reserves, the way, Werner said was known. But then Mises explained, and that's what causes the business cycle per se. There's no way to do it in a healthy manner. That process per se causes the boom bust cycle. And, and that's that's what it seems like Werner did not quite get to that part of the lesson. Okay, I'm done. Jonathan, do you have any parting words for the audience?
Yeah, one last thing that I'll say about this. So he talks about the asset price inflation if banks are lending and people are just using it to bid up, real estate, stock prices, and so on. And he talks about the consumption that just causes inflation. But the main case study that he's looked at is the Japanese experience. And so what if the problem is bank lending that's being used to bid up asset prices or bank lending that's just being used for consumption, then the correction to those problems it's just a nominal problem. So for an asset price inflation, suppose it's a bubble, like a speculative bubble, then the correction that needs to happen is just new prices. But people just discover the new prices that reflect actual productivity or the actual value of the underlying assets. In the case of consumption, it's like, yeah, there's a new higher level of prices, and people, obviously that's unpopular, people don't like that, but it's just like this nominal increase in prices of consumer goods. But if you see in cases like the Great Depression or the Great Recession in the US or even the Japanese experience where they had this long recession, it means that there's some real problem. And I mean real in the economic sense. Like there's
as
something,
opposed to monetary.
Yeah. It's not just a nominal problem. It's not something that could be fixed by just people changing prices. It's not something that just results in a price change. But there's actual real resources that are misallocated. There's labor that had been used in an unproductive way, and now people are unemployed and they're trying to find a productive and profitable way for them to be employed. So you actually have to move scarce real resources around. And if that's the case, then the problem is not that banks were lending and that lending caused asset prices to increase, or that banks were lending and people were just using it for consumption, because those problems are fixed, or the consequences of them is just change in prices, just nominal fix. It means that the problem is actually a real one, and the one that the answer, the solution to this is, well, you need an explanation for the real changes in production and capital employment and labor employment that happens when businesses take those loans, and then they come up with a new structure of production. So it seems to me like there's a big gaping hole in his framework, and that gaping hole is.
So that's about it. There's a minute or so left for the yap. That last part is interesting. So I'm half on board with the way the Austrians explain the Great Depression. So if you look at it in my research and doing it, one of the first catalysts was the Model T, right? The growth of cars, right? And all the offshoots of that. Heavy growth out of World War I, right? For the first 5 years of the 20s, roaring 20s, right? And then that kind of fell off. It reached market saturation at that point for Model Ts, and that fell off. Well, at the same time, you had Coolidge dropping deficits, so they were looking for a surplus, right? So now you're taking net financial assets out of the economy. At the same time, the real issue of the market saturation of the car industry happened in the mid-20s. And what you saw was an uptick, and this is where I think Jonathan and Bob would agree with me, an uptick in margin lending. So you saw this huge bubble in assets in the stock market, right? So you had, the great first half of the 20s, right, with real productive growth, like real growth in the car industry, right? Then you had a reduction in the deficit by Coolidge, right? And then you had banks coming in, and because there's still that remnants of economic activity, and they start pumping up margin loans. And now the next big thing after the car revolution and the Model T is everybody can get into the stock market now, and you've got margin loans, so you can leverage yourself to the hill, right? And that pushed up asset prices. So in that regard, right, I agree, there were underlying issues with the Great Depression, but it was a combination of both real and nominal effects, right? It wasn't just one or the other. And this is what we do at modern macro technologies, is we are very explicitly modeling the interaction between nominal aspects of the economy and the real aspects of the economy, right? You have to do them in tandem. You can't look at, well, this is a complete, if you're, let's say, an MMT, or say, well, you've reduced the deficit, now we're hooped. Well, what's going on in the real economy underneath, right? The private sector does drive the business cycle, right? Does it need assistance, right? So Keynes never advocated for constant deficit spending. He advocated that in slumps it would be deficit spending. right? But you got to look at both going together. And the Austrians, to their credit, do like to examine the real aspects of the economy, where I have probably a lot of agreements with them. So that's very important. And at the end of the conversation, that part I will semi agree with. To sum this whole video up, it seems like our biggest problem between the economic schools is the terminology, right? A lot of things we agree on, but we use different terminology. Now, in the video they had, again, there was nothing new. They agreed with a lot of what Richard Warner said, but they didn't like some aspects of it. And so Bob and Jonathan pushed, the fractional reserve banking system, talked a lot about gold, which isn't relevant to our current economy, and things that I've disagreed with them in the past, right? So there was really no new insights there. Um, I will say they were respectable. Richard Warner's outside of their circle. They were respectable. They watched the video. Jonathan went and looked for articles that Richard had written, right? So, in that sense, I can't attack them for not being thorough. They were quite thorough. I will attack them, though. Their analysis is still based in this rigid, fixed gold, government gold currency. That's not applicable to how the economy works now. And I know the detractors of Austrian economics, mainly the MMT, say it's impossible for their framework to be used in the current day of free floating fiat currencies. I would argue, if you read a little bit of the literature, it could be adapted into the modern sense of the economy, especially around uses around real resources and whatnot. And an example there, we had the Great Depression, which was back during a gold standard. But, if we had something like that where an AI could be a catalyst. So we're having an AI revolution right now, and it's debatable if it's to the same effect as, the car was. But we could say that's a real productive gain, right? Like, so Doug and I, we use AI all the time. It's very productive for us, right? And it helps us in our business. And you could say that will peter out, right? It'll hit market saturation. I know there's questions, AI is going to take over the world, maybe, but I doubt it, right? I doubt it at this point. Maybe it will. Maybe the CIA might knock at my door one day. Who knows? But eventually that will kind of hit a market saturation, but we'll still have the residual bounce of that, economic increase. And do we turn to another system where we're now investing in the assets, the financial assets of the AI revolution, where maybe banks or financial institutions give us the ability to leverage ourselves and buy these financial assets and pump up a boom, and we have another kind of Great Depression situation, right? And those situations, I'm more than willing to listen to Austrian economics, right? Looking at the real aspects of the economy. I have to say, I enjoyed the video. I'm glad I watched it top to bottom. It started off kind of janky with the whole look at, he doesn't have as many followers as Jonathan. When it turns out he actually has 40,000 followers on one account, 20,000 on his second account, and 7,000 on his third account. So that's a terrible metric to kind of start your analysis off. But I will assume that Bob was just making a joke about that, and we can move past it. And that's kind of my summary on how I felt. They basically agreed on everything. The what oughts to happen were obviously different. The Austrians have a very novel what ought to happen in the economy based on a gold standard, et cetera, et cetera. They really emphasize, malinvestment, the rate of change of interest rates that drives the business cycle, whereas I don't myself, right? I believe it's a private interaction between households and firms to drive the business cycle, and we can look at lots of Fred data to prove that. Anyways, it was fun. I'm going to do shorter reaction videos, so that was way, way, way too long. I couldn't yap enough. I had to listen to Jonathan and Bob yap too much. So I'm going to do this each week, so if you've got an idea, put it in the comments, right? Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you're on YouTube. Same thing with on X. This was live on X, hit the notification bell, follow me there, right? You can watch there, chat there. And if you're on my Patreon, well, hit the like button there, and maybe hit the like button on the Twitter video, or not the Twitter video, the YouTube video. Help with the algorithm. As for any other housekeeping, I've recently decided, because I started this channel as like a modeling tutorial channel, and it kind of just lost its way over the years. And I've decided, okay, I'm going to kind of rejig everything to a live streaming channel, right? And so I was going from 100 views a video, and now I'm up to 300 to 400 doing this kind of live stream platform. So it just seems to be a little more successful, and hopefully we can grow it, right? I'm not going to be the next Joe Rogan for sure. But it's great to get the ideas of, the post-Keynesian and the MMT kind of click out there, but also be inclusive of, let's say, the other heterodox school, which is Austrian economics, and despite all its faults that I think it has, it's sure as hell a lot better than neoclassical economics or conventional economics at this point. So that's that, and we will see you on Friday. We've got Steve Keen, we've got Mike Radzicki, and we've got the philosopher Daniel Sanderson. We're just going to yap about economics. It should be a whole lot of fun. We're going to do that. It'll be at 12 p.m. New York time, Friday, which is 5 p.m. London time. And if you're in Amsterdam, let's say that would be 6 p.m. On Friday. So join in. We'll see you then. Until then, goodbye.
You are now relearning economics.